Okay, this is Intersectional Mobilization, Social Movement Spillover, and Queer Youth Leadership in the Immigrant Rights Movement from Race, Class, Gender, 10th edition. Okay, so the article looks at LGBTQ immigrant youth in the DREAM movement and points out that queer youth activists were highly visible in the contemporary immigrant rights movement in the early 2010s. And DREAMers were the ones who led the charge to gain congressional support for the Federal Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors, otherwise known as DREAM Act, which, among other rights, worked for a pathway to citizenship for eligible youth. So borrowing from the gay and lesbian movement's coming out of the closet narrative, DREAMers organized coming out of the shadows campaigns to combat the stigma of being undocumented and humanize the experiences of these young undocumented people. So the author is interested in the visibility of LGBTQ immigrant youth in the DREAM movement, as people of color and immigrants can often encounter challenges to publicly disclosing a queer identity. Also, the immigrant rights movement of that time was focused on pathways to citizenship so that some people's queer identities remained invisible when they were organizing for immigrant rights. So her research questions were, how can movements mobilize their members based on their intersectional identities? And how can they generate high levels of participation among multiply marginalized subgroups within their broader constituencies? So the author postulates that LGBTQ representation and visibility is due to the identity formation processes within the DREAM movement itself. Also, the article explores social movement spillover, in the case of the coming out narrative, which enables people to embrace a stigmatized identity, which connects the stigmatized identities of LGBTQ individuals and that of being undocumented in the U.S. So the author also explores the potential for a boomerang effect, which we'll discuss in a sec. Okay, so moving on to intersectionality and barriers to the public display of an LGBTQ identity. So the article looks at intersectionality theory that argues that each person has multiple identities that link to broader structures of inequality, which gives us a social location. And each person's social location shapes how they experience unequal power relations and make sense of their surroundings. So intersectional theoretical frameworks also suggest that non-white youth from low-income and undocumented backgrounds might experience a number of challenges to openly disclosing a queer identity. Also, being undocumented can add to the risks of coming out as a sexual minority. So in the semi-structured interview findings, right, this was the approach used by the researcher. Semi-structured just means that there's a set of questions, but it's much more conversational in approach as you let people kind of go on tangents or explore, their understandings of certain things, which can be very helpful in research like this to find things that you weren't actually necessarily asking for, right? So in her research, she found a theme of barriers to public displays of an LGBTQ identity among the undocumented. So the evidence indicated that activists often encountered obstacles to coming out of the closet within their families or within their larger immigrant communities. So she found in her interviews that for most queer dreamers, coming out of the closet was a very painful experience, and some still continued to struggle with being open about their sexual orientation. And an interesting parallel that she also found in her interviews was how many queer activists said that their peers knew about their queer identity, but 2/5 of them had not disclosed their undocumented status. So similar with sexual identity, the stigmatized identity of being undocumented led some to strategically disclose that information to others. Most of the participants also said that homophobia in their families or community created a barrier to coming out of the closet. And for the undocumented, coming out to unsupportive family members could also have legal consequences, as with one respondent that she uses as an example, who met his estranged father when he was a teenager, and his dad promised to help him get papers, but that changed when he came out as gay. So also, in addition to family barriers, some queer dreamers also expressed concerns about being out when engaging in activism, as the immigrant rights movement seeks mainstream and religious support, which can both be prejudicial to queer individuals. So when looking at the movement level collective identity formation and the spillover of the coming out strategy, the coming out of the shadows strategy in the immigrants' rights movement was successful nationally. And what's interesting is that out LGBTQ individuals did not disproportionately self-select to be in the movement. That's not why they were visible. In her findings, she suggests that social movement spillover produced a boomerang effect, where the coming out strategy that was emboldening immigrant activists, meaning the coming out of the shadows strategy that was borrowed from the gay and lesbian movement, emboldened immigrant activists to support LGBTQ inclusivity. So the boomerang effect fueled intersectional mobilization as the strategy of coming out led to a public declaration of two marginalized identities. So these declarations inspired some activists to disclose their queer identity after encountering the out of the shadows narrative. So the full circle, or as the author puts it, a boomerang effect, right? Where one movement strategy inspires another movement strategy and actually kind of goes full circle within that other movement. So in the discussion section, right, she discusses some of the issues of historical context, meaning the Dream movement emerged during an era of increased activism and acceptance of LGBTQ identities. So that also plays a role in why there was kind of more widespread support within the movement. And findings from the study indicate that queer youth's visibility in the movement is related to their intersectional mobilization, or the activation of queer identities within the Dream movement. So queer youth brought an intersectional consciousness to address LGBTQ issues within the immigrants' rights movement, making that movement stronger. So the article demonstrates how undocumented immigrant youths themselves, when in these spaces, when engaging in activism, exercise agency, right? Meaning they collectively shape their own social and political incorporation within those social movements. And again, interestingly, with this boomerang effect, we see the potential to link larger social movements through this process of intersectional mobilization.